Hi, welcome to our second unit, Ancient Near East. So we're heading over to the Mediterranean. We're going to be spending some time here over the next couple of units. But let us begin where it all began. So as we're considering this area, let's come back to Çatalhöyük for a moment and how we talked about how it formed right next to a river. All these early settlements, cities, etc., for most of time are going to be established near fresh water. And so we have the same thing here with our Tigris and Euphrates River, where these civilizations expand near these rivers. This is located in modern-day Iraq. We're going to start with the Sumer area, as you can see in southern Iraq, Middle East. So the first cities, this urban revolution. In our previous unit, we discussed the Neolithic time period and where this is a shift in human consciousness where we start to settle. We have the agricultural revolution, the domestication of plants and animals, and now we're going to have the urban revolution, the birth of cities. And we're going to start with Uruk, modern-day Warka, and it is the first city. From 3500 to 3000 BCE is where it's established. Now, however, I do want to talk about briefly, the concept of nationalism doesn't come around until the late 1700s. This is an extremely recent concept when we consider history. What I mean by that is nowadays, if I'm traveling abroad and I introduce myself and someone asks where I'm from, I would say, oh, I'm from America. Or if I was traveling around America, I would say, oh, I'm from Texas. Those concepts didn't exist back then. Instead, you have city-states, where the city itself is its own political entity, where each city would have its own king. And so a comparison is if I was traveling and someone asked where I was from, I would say I'm from Houston. The idea of Texas and the idea of America, especially of this national identity, did not exist. That doesn't come about in the shift in human consciousness, again, until the late 1700s. And so even though I'm describing these people as Sumerian, that would not have been how they described themselves. There are aspects of their culture and language that unify them that we now in modern day, as historians, describe it as Sumer. But just note that these people at this time period would have identified with their city-state, Uruk. So at this point, we have an agricultural surplus. And so this allows for a specialization of laborers, or of different types of occupations. People can become priests, bureaucrats, craftsmen. There's free time. Not everyone needs to be a farmer, in other words. Only some people need to tend the crops and animals. They're also ruled, we're going to begin with the rulership by an elite group with military, religious, political control, and they're supported by taxes and tributes. So taxes is this monetary payment to the city-state. Tributes, consider if you were like a farmer and you have a surplus of your wheat or whatnot, then you would bring in that surplus or 10% of your crops, etc. We also have the establishment of monumental architecture. So these are the key periods that we're going to study. This is on your handout, kind of a way to remember. Santa Anna never baked a nutty pancake, if that helps you then. Okay, so the urban revolution. I like this quote by the historian: early Near Eastern villagers domesticated plants and animals, but Uruk urban institutions in turn domesticated humans. So we have the establishment of institutions. We have this shift into the birth of modern cities. Okay, so we're moving into Uruk. And we have the creation of writing. So we are no longer in our prehistoric period. History is being written down. Now, you may refer to your iPad or other tablets as tablets, and if you have a writing instrument for those, a stylus. Those terms actually come from the beginning of writing and from cuneiform with our stylus and our clay tablet. So the stylus is that instrument. As you can see, the end is a triangle shape. And so you would press that into the clay tablet to create this written text. Now, we're going to study several different cultures, and they have different languages, but they're all using the same written form, this cuneiform. So consider how English, Spanish, French, etc. We have different languages, but we're using the same written language alphabet. Here's some examples. What's also really neat is we know so much about this history because it's written down. We've found these tablets. They're written on the images. Some, of course, are exaggerated for propaganda, but we know so much about these cultures from their written texts. And I just want to re-emphasize again how ancient people were not primitive by any means. They were just as complex as we are under different circumstances. For example, here's an image of a complaint about delivery of the wrong grade of copper from 1750 BCE. This was essentially a Yelp review. Someone is saying they ordered this grade of copper, they didn't receive what they ordered, and they're upset about it. So these people are just as complex. Again, we're going to see written text on historical or markers of historical events. Okay, so let's start with ziggurats, some of the famous structures of this region. Now, ziggurat means platform, and these are platforms for the temples. So when you look at these structures, these monumental structures, your initial impression may be that, oh, this was the temple itself. You would walk inside of it. However, that's not the case. Our geography defines our culture, and we are not near any type of quarry, even though this is an extremely fertile region aligned for agriculture. It's not a heavily wooded region. In fact, the ancient stories and texts talk about how they would have to go to Lebanon to get more wood, so that's a precious material. Instead, we're using the mud brick of this region, or the mud of this region. And so if you look in the upper picture, essentially looks like a mound of dirt, and then that would be covered with this mud brick. This is a modern reconstruction done under Saddam Hussein. Notice this area is also it's a desert region. Previously, it would have been a fertile part of the fertile region. It's along the old path of the Euphrates River. Some of it changed over time naturally. Unfortunately, a significant portion of the river was changed purposefully by Saddam Hussein in an attempted genocide. But the temples themselves would have been on top of these platforms, on top of these ziggurats, made of wood, which no longer exists. So our interpretation of them are primarily based on the floor plans and what's been found. So we're going to start with the White Temple and its ziggurat at Uruk. Okay, so politically we're at a time period. This is the beginning of humanity. Remember, all of this is new. Humans are creating cities by trial and error. These concepts are brand new, so I want us to keep that in mind. And so it begins by this ruling group. We're not quite in the era of kings. And so when we're considering the establishment of authority by a ruling group, one of the aspects is that whoever controls the food supply controls the people. And so we're in a period where there's surplus agriculture, and so that is going to be controlled by this ruling elite, this group. We have evidence of a lot of this surplus agriculture being stored in these temples. And later we'll see where like the state treasuries, think ancient Greece, are stored in the temples, but right now we're having the surplus agriculture. So they're in charge of, in case of emergency, of handing this out. So that gives them power and authority. They're also, of course, in charge of the religion. Now, there is no difference between politics and religion at this time point. This ruling class is essentially the priest class. So that's important to note too. These temples and the ziggurats, the platforms in which they were on, were also established in the center of the city. Okay? Now consider how large these ziggurats are, and how most of the domestic structures of this city are one story. It's also centrally placed. What that means is that anywhere in the city, you can see this ziggurat, you can see this temple, of which only the ruling elite have access to. So this re-emphasizes their power. So yes, this is a religious structure, but it's also just as much political and also just as much a symbol of power. Now the White Temple and its ziggurat. Let's go into it in a little more detail. Here's some constructions. See how we have the floor plans in which we've established our understanding of this temple. And you'll notice this term on the screen called the bent access approach. And this is referring to the staircase leading up to the temple. Now consider this. When we think of an ancient temple, a Greek temple probably pops into our head where it's this grand staircase that leads right up to the entrance. That's not the case here. We have a staircase that is at an angle, and it's narrow, and it doesn't lead up to the front of the building. So I want you to consider why that would be based on what I've just told you. Okay. Well, hopefully you figured out that it is, again, a power move that only the elite have access to this temple. It's not inviting the commoners. It's not inviting everyone else. It's only this ruling class that is able to access the temple. And it's only the ruling class that is able to access the divine. Now let's talk a little bit more about why this is important and how this helps us understand these cultures. So the concept of nationalism does not come around until the late 1700s. Again, so if I'm introducing myself abroad, I would say that I'm from Houston. I'm not identifying as Texan or as an American. And so each of these city-states are their own political units. Each city-state also had their own god or goddess. It was their patron deity. Patron, and then deity from the last unit, D-E-I-T-Y. Now, Uruk is special in that it has two patron deities, okay? Anu and Eannatum, the two gods of Uruk. This helps to re-emphasize Uruk's importance. It becomes the administrative center, the most important city-state of this area, and thus it's deserving of two gods of for its patron deities. When these city-states were at war with one another, they considered it that their gods were at war with one another. If they were losing, then they had fallen out of favor, and they would need to act quickly to reestablish favor with the gods. We have two entrances here for Anu and Eannatum to enter their waiting rooms, their areas. Again, it's rare to have two. So these elite few have direct access to the gods through this temple. Think of how this reestablishes power of this clear social hierarchy, this stratified society that we have. That it's not that anyone can directly access the gods. You have to do so through these people. Okay. So within this structure, you have waiting rooms where within these rooms, you would have a sculpture of the patron god or goddess, and you would essentially wait for them to inhabit this space. So I'll come back to that slide, but I just want to go through these floor plan reconstructions. Again, we're not sure if this is exactly what it would have looked like. Oh, I should have mentioned, it's called the White Temple because it would have been covered in plaster on the exterior, this white plaster. So think of how this would, with the sun, it would gleam brightly. So you would enter into the temple, and notice how we have these decorative doors. And within each god's waiting room, you would have likely a statue of that god. And so those are considered the waiting rooms. And in fact, I'm going to skip ahead to the votive statues. And so if you'll come back to the article that you read, and after this, I'll want you to go back and take some more notes about the important terms mentioned in that article. And so you have these statues of these votive figures. Now again, you as a normal citizen do not have direct access to the gods. However, if you are higher up on the socioeconomic level, you can then afford a votive statue that you'd be able to purchase, and it would stand in for you in these waiting rooms. What that means is that out of these votive statues, it would be placed in front of the statue of the god. So let's say your votive statue is placed in the room of Anu, and it would be waiting there for the waiting rooms for the god to inhabit that sculpture. This enables you to commune with the gods through this votive statue. It stands there on your behalf. Now notice what's emphasized here, and this is going to help define our Sumerian stylistic characteristics, is we have these large eyes. There's such an emphasis on them. Most of them are clearly outlined. They have these large pupils. And so they're in this stance of awaiting the gods, where they are fully focused. Their hands are clasped. Some consider that like a prayer, but most of them are holding something, so it resembles more of an offering that they're giving to the gods, that they're waiting to give to them. We also have examples of notes written down, etc. And so this was one of the few ways in which people could commune with the gods. Now I want to introduce a new term, hierarchy of scale. And so this is where scale shows our hierarchy. Notice how we have larger figures, we have some that are more detailed, we have smaller figures. The larger figures are obviously more expensive and more important. People who were able to purchase the larger ones were higher up on our social hierarchy. So we'll see this play out for this entire semester, the concept of hierarchy of scale, which tells us our hierarchy of those people. So again, I want you to reread that article that was assigned and take some detailed notes about these figures because I love them. So I will always ask questions about them on the test, the exams. Okay, so let's come back to zoom out a little bit, and we're going to talk about the temple and our theme for this unit of domestic versus wild. And you'll notice on the screen I have foundational deposits. So we found these votive statues buried underneath these temples for whatever reason, perhaps upon the patron's death or whatnot. But what we've also found, and which we find today in many cultures when they are creating a religious structure, is a foundational deposit. So underneath this temple, there are the bones of a leopard and a lion. Consider how we've already discussed in our prehistoric era how these are symbols of power, right? We're also going to see the bull come up as a symbol of power. We are in a period where plants and animals are domesticated, where humans are gaining more power in the circle of life, if you'll consider it. And so if you are establishing your power, we're beyond just using a lion or a leopard as a symbol of power, but you are so powerful as a human that you dominate that powerful symbol. That the most ferocious predator in the wild you are dominating, that you've domesticated. So here's our domestic versus wild. And this is a theme that we'll see play out of where the civilizations and the role of the ruler is to conquer the wild. So we see that here with just the establishment of our foundational deposits. Even certain religions, as they build temples or even housing structures today, will have foundational deposits. Here's Gilgamesh, if you're doing the extra credit. Here's an example of him, and he's holding a lion, and look how he is in control versus this lion that he has caught. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about these ruling authorities and how we see this in art, and this establishment of social hierarchy and political control. And so before we have this group of ruling elite, and we start to see the concept of En, which means priest king, play out. And this is where one of these priests, not named yet, take a little more authority in whatever manner. And so it's not one specific person that's in control of everyone, but these different priests will rotate, if you will. And we see that in these cylinder seals. And so what these are, if you've seen a movie during like the medieval period of how some person's going to send a letter, and so they drop some wax onto the envelope and then they press their ring or their stamp on it to show that it's from them, as well as to make sure that no one else opens it. I want you to consider that idea with our cylinder seals and how the seal is, you can see how it would be rolled out onto clay and then this image would appear. It's been carved out into the cylinder seal, and as it rolls over the clay, it creates this low relief, if you will. And so each person would have their own cylinder seal. We have these holes on top where it would be worn as a necklace and representing you or your occupation. And we actually have learned a lot about these ancient cultures from their cylinder seals, aside from the writing. Here we have the ends roll, the priest king's roll. If you'll notice that they are holding different types of grains, and they're feeding them to the animals. So one of the roles of the priest is, again, to take care of the people, to make sure that they have enough food. They're in charge of the surplus agriculture. They're in charge of making sure the domesticated animals are well fed, etc., so that the people can survive. So we see that play out here. Now, what we'll see in the top left and the bottom, this motif of these two raised lines that come into this curve, that is associated with the goddess Eannatum, a goddess of love and war, but also oversees agriculture and domesticated animals. So these are in these images to also show how the role of this priest king is still to, again, they're the ones communing with Eannatum and acting on her behalf. There's also examples of hunting scenes, etc. So the role of the priest king is religious, political, or military, as well as hunts. There's this clear social hierarchy. But I also want to point out with this cylinder seal is our hierarchy of scale coming through again. How there's a clear indicator of which figure is more important, the figure on the right. Not only is he slightly larger, but he has a longer, more decorative skirt. And he's also wearing, on his head is what becomes indicative of the status of these ends, of these priest kings, where his hair is longer, both have longer hair, but his hair is in a bun at the nape of his neck, that little circular motif right there. And then he's either wearing a cap or a fillet, F-I-L-L-E-T, this is on your handout, but that's a band, such as like a leather band that's just wrapped around the forehead and tied in the back. So it could be part of the cap or on top of it, but either way, this motif is indicative of the end of the ruler. Here, again, our end is larger. Our hierarchy of scale is seen to show his importance. The eyes are still emphasized. They're also shown in 3/4 view, so not quite twisted perspective. The shoulders are slightly turned. Okay, so here is where we start to see this shift. We see it in the text, we see it in the imagery, and here's our fragment of the victory stele Eannatum. So we're going from in, which translates as priest king, to Lugal. And Lugal means big man. This word choice indicates his importance and the shift in the role of the primary leader. And we also see it in the style. I mean, clear hierarchy of scale. We can definitely see who the most important person is as part of this stele. So big man, again, the roles have changed. We now have the establishment of a singular leader. He still has the religious role. He's connected to the divine, to the deity, but he's also extremely much more political. We're showing the military might here with the word choice, as well as look how big he is. His hierarchy of scale is clearly seen. Also, we know their names. So instead of it just being this rotating role, instead we have a specific ruler, Eannatum. And we start to have art that tells the story of victories and of battles won, etc. Sometimes exaggerated. So this is part of a fragment of what would have been a whole stele. We only have bits of it, but we still, again, have the cuneiform, so we can read the text and what's going on here. So let's talk about some of the formal elements. Again, the hierarchy of scale. What we'll see with Sumer is that either the whole chest is exposed or they have just one shoulder covered, and so we still see the shoulder, the strength of him, in other words. Behind him are these soldiers with their shields, with their spears. He's leading them into battle. His arm is raised. They conquered this formidable foe, and it's clearly written in the cuneiform to describe the story. Note that, like most written texts, this is exaggerated. It is a form of propaganda because he is communicating to his people his power. So it may be a little exaggerated. There's also an attempt at space. If we look at these soldiers, where it's almost like an aerial view to an extent, at least an angled, where these overlapping figures are showing a sense of space. In the upper register, we also have these soldiers where they're walking in uniform or uniformly together, where they have their shields protecting them. Notice how they are all standing on something. They're above the ground, and our Lugal, our big man, Eannatum, is standing directly on the ground, and he's still larger than them. So the ultimate emphasis is on our Lugal, our big man, our Eannatum. His clothing is much more decorative and detailed as well. And so here we see this shift. Again, trial and error. The concept of leadership is still new for these massive civilizations that are battling one another. And when I say massive, we're talking, for example, with Uruk, which we started with, there were about 20,000 to 50,000 people. Okay, let's talk about the standard of Ur from the royal tombs at Ur. Here's the size of it. Now, the nomenclature is wrong. A standard is what you would consider like movie scenes of ancient battles and how they would be carrying their standard, their flags, etc., to represent who they are. And so when this was first found at the royal tombs at Ur, the assumption was it was a standard, but it's actually more likely a musical instrument. And so we have two different sides to it. So before I go into the details, actually, let's talk about the medium. It's wood inlaid with shell, lapis lazuli, and red limestone. The medium itself tells us of the importance of these people. The lapis lazuli comes from Afghanistan. The red limestone is closer to India. So there is extensive trade here. These materials are extremely expensive. So this attests to the wealth of this city-state. Now there's two different sides, and I want to start with our war side, where there's clearly a battle that has gone on. Now it's divided into three registers. However, eyes are immediately drawn to the most important figure, and there are some formal elements about how we know his importance. Number one, we have our clear hierarchy of scale. If we're considering the composition, so the different areas of this scene, he is also centrally placed on the top register, where our eyes are often drawn automatically to the center of art objects. And he's also a little bit lighter than the other figures. Obviously, he's aged, but our eyes are still drawn to him. Now, also notice how his head goes beyond the register. The top of his head goes in front of it. So we've gone from our Eannatum, consider how his head touches the top of the right, or the bottom of the register, but here we have our big guy, our Lugal, who is even in front of the register. He's so large, so he looms over the others. So while we're at the top register, let's consider reading this image. This from the left, we have a chariot. We have a sense of space with our overlapping horses, which is an important aspect of our elements of space. And then we have our hierarchy of scale, where we have this small figure who is obviously lower on the totem pole. As we move along, we're going past our main important figure, And then we see these bound captives, and they're being led to the Lugal. Now, here's an element that we're going to see play out for several units across time, and the way how you depict your foe or your conquered people, largely to a population that cannot read. So we talked about the establishment of cuneiform, but keep in mind that up until pretty recently, that most of the population across the globe could not read. It was for a select few. So you have to consider how to communicate your intentions and these stories and your message just visually. And so we have this conquered foe. And if you'll notice, they are wearing little or no clothing. This is a common motif. Think of our domestic versus wild. That the enemy is going to be portrayed as this wild, nude, almost, again, this wild enemy that's been conquered. Were these people really naked running into battle? No, but it's an element to communicate how they've been conquered. And also this idea that they're lesser than. Consider how they're a little bit smaller than some of the soldiers who are leading them. They're also bound. Their hands are often behind their hands are tied together. We'll see that play out for history. And as we move down into our next register, there's also a clear indication of who's been conquered. Some are starting to fall to the ground, maybe being dragged. And we also have these figures on the left. I want to re-emphasize domestic versus wild here, because they are clearly officers or higher up in the military because of these likely leopard skin cloaks that they're wearing. Again, they've conquered this wild animal. So they're establishing their authority that way. If we come to the bottom register, notice how we have these chariots and how they are trampling over the enemy, this naked bound enemy. Now, for much of time, for almost all of time until the last century, over a century, really established with several countries, but then spread across the globe with Great Britain as we have the ending of slavery. But for all of time, when a person was conquered, they would then become the slaves of those people. So it's not that we're seeing an example of a prisoner of war here where they're held captive. They become the labor force, the slave for these people. And we'll see that play out, and we have the text about it. But here is we have this establishment of how to show a conquered enemy. We're showing them as these wild, naked creatures, essentially. They're lesser than. Were they in real life? No, of course they're wearing their full regalia for battle. These city-states where there's a reason why they're fighting one another is for the wealth and resources that they have. In here we have the peace side. So the battle has been won. We're now celebrating. So in our top register, we clearly see our main figure, our Gaul. His head extends beyond the bottom of the register. However, he's on the left side now. We have our hierarchy of scale, where the servants are much smaller. They're serving the drinks for this banquet, or they're playing music on the far right. See that harp? Whereas our important figures, likely in the military, some argue that it was the officers that we just saw with those leopard cloaks. But here they're seated in enjoying this banquet. Notice that if they all stood up, just how massive our Lugal would be, our king would be. Now, the register below is where we have these sheep and bulls that are being brought. Likely they were being pulled from the conquered city-state. And beneath we see the more agricultural productions that are being brought to this to the city-state that had come out as the conqueror.